The national pay talks, it's feared tonight they could be close to breakdown. The Taoiseach still hopeful for the peace process. He'll meet John Major on Monday week. And the High Court has told Geraldine Gilligan and her husband were partners in crime. Good evening. The talks on a new national pay agreement have run into serious difficulties tonight, and there are fears that the negotiations could be close to breakdown. The difficulties are understood to relate to public sector pay and whether public sector employees should be paid a lesser increase than private sector workers. The government says the chairman of the pay talks has asked both sides to consider their positions before the negotiations resume next Monday. With the pay talks in difficulty, the National Executive of the Irish Nurses Organisation has called an immediate strike ballot in its pay dispute with the government.
The die is cast this evening. The National Executive of the INO has called an immediate ballot of its members. They say the first nationwide strike by nurses is now all but inevitable next January. There seems little chance tonight that the gap between nurses and government can now be bridged. Early retirement and a better deal for younger nurses are key priorities, with wide differences too on pay. The top of the scale for staff nurses is currently just under £18,000. The government has offered £20,350 for those with more than 15 years service, but nurses themselves want £25,000. Ward sisters can now earn £20,144. They're being offered just over £23,500, but they're seeking a max of the scale at £30,000. Health Minister Michael Noonan again confirmed today that the government has no money to improve its £50 million offer. With the sides deadlocked, nurses say their strike will go ahead.
For the first time ever, right across the country, all elective admissions to hospitals will cease from a given date, possibly towards the end of January. By that I mean that planned admissions for emergency surgery will all be cancelled. Outpatients clinics will then all cease on the day the strike commences, and patients who are capable of being sent home, particularly in long-stay hospitals, to have relatives care for them for the duration of a strike, will be sent home. And nurses will be available to continue the maintenance of emergency services where required.
But as a nurses' strike moves nearer, the Committee on Higher Remuneration in the Public Service has recommended that hospital consultants get a backdated pay increase of 6%, twice the figure on offer to other public sector employees. It's concern over the public sector pay bill, which is understood to be at the centre tonight of the serious difficulties threatening talks on a new national pay agreement. Union sources talk of serious barriers. Employer sources say the talks are very close to breakdown. The divide, it appears, is over whether or not public sector employees should be paid a lesser increase than their private sector counterparts. With wide differences now on taxation and on both private and public sector pay, the talks here at government buildings have adjourned until Monday. But there's real pessimism tonight that the gaps can now be bridged.
Northern Ireland and the current state of the peace process is expected to be high on the agenda when the Taoiseach meets the British Prime Minister John Major at a summit in London on Monday week. The visit is part of a series by Mr Bruton to European capitals in the run-up to the EU summit in Dublin. Mr Bruton said today that he believes the current difficulties in the peace process can be overcome. He was speaking in Luxembourg following the latest apparent setback for the Hume-Adams proposals for getting Sinn Féin into political talks.
The Taoiseach was in Luxembourg today as part of his tour of EU capitals in preparations for next month's Dublin summit. Mr Bruton is keeping in constant touch with developments in the peace process. He gave this assessment of the current difficulties.
There are a lot of questions being asked. Questions being asked, obviously, about the viability and durability of the ceasefire, but also questions being asked about the talks process, the time frame for the talks process on the other side of the issue. And it's important, I think, that this time we try to be as careful as possible in laying the grounds for the next step, so that there won't be misunderstandings after the event. And therefore, I think we should be as patient as possible in getting the detail right here in the discussions that are going on at the present time.
Do you believe this problem can be overcome?
Oh yes, it can be overcome, but it's a question on the side of all of the parties of marshalling the political will to overcome it, which involves the final analysis trying to satisfy the requirements of one's traditional antagonist.
While Mr Bruton was in Luxembourg, back in Dublin, the Fianna Fáil leader Bertie Ahern was suggesting the Unionists have Mr Major in a corner, effectively holding a veto over Sinn Féin involvement in the talks.
No, that is not the case. There is no veto over progress. But obviously, in finding a formula that will not only get us a ceasefire, but get us a talks process that will move forward in a reasonably purposeful way, everybody's legitimate concerns, including those of the Unionists and of Sinn Féin, have to be taken into account, as well as everyone else's concerns too.
So where do you take it from here? Will there be, for instance, a common position among the parties in the Dáil? Will there be a common position among the two governments?
There is intensive negotiation going on at the present time, which involves a number of parties, including the two governments, with a view to finding a basis which will resolve the issue. And those are ongoing on an hourly basis at the present time.
The Taoiseach said he agrees with the view of Sinn Féin's Mitchell McLaughlin that what's needed now is a leap of faith. But he said that leap of faith also involves faith in others. Mr Bruton is on his way back to Dublin tonight.
Sinn Féin's Mitchell McLaughlin said his party was not going to walk away from the peace process, despite yesterday's apparent setback. The Ulster Unionist leader David Trimble said he wanted the British government to publish the terms of John Major's reply to John Hume.
Memories of a more hopeful time as Senator George Mitchell unveils a portrait of Bill Clinton this morning, almost a year after the President's emotional visit to Northern Ireland. Now the political picture is less rosy, with the talks struggling and deep uncertainty over the prospects for a fresh IRA ceasefire. The Senator said this morning his and the President's fervent hope remained that the people of Ireland would see lasting peace. And in the United States, a reflection of increasing American concern. Publisher Neil O'Dowd, who played a pivotal role in the process, said the Clinton administration is increasingly worried about the turn of events.
Well, my sense is from talking to them is that they're very disappointed right now, that they feel there's a crisis atmosphere. And for the first time since before the election, the White House is very focused on this issue. I know there's been a number of calls made to the White House to ask the President to personally intervene. And I think that's where we're at. I think there is a crisis sense now, and that the administration must step in again. In fact, I think that'll be one of the things that'll be obvious in the next few days, that the administration has ratcheted up their interest in the issue at this point.
While Sinn Féin's Mitchell McLaughlin said that even if there was another statement from John Major, his party wasn't optimistic.
I'm very much afraid that when that arrives, it will in fact bear out our worst fears, that in fact the British government will have introduced a whole new set of criteria, effectively raising the bar on our participation in talks, even if there is an IRA cessation.
As the contacts continued, David Trimble said John Major's reply to the SDLP leader should be published, but he warned the British government not to yield to blackmail.
Look what's been happening this week. A leading member of Sinn Féin IRA has been telling the government, telling Mr Major, do what we say or there will be lethal consequences. In other words, he's holding a gun to the head of the government, saying accept our demands or we start bombing and killing again. Now, what government can react to that?
John Major's 6-page reply to the SDLP leader is, I understand, couched in general terms and doesn't explicitly reject the proposals worked out with Gerry Adams. That has encouraged the Irish government and the two-party leaders, but they remain concerned at the negative interpretation being put on the letter by Downing Street sources. But as long as there's no definitive public statement from the British, hope remains that there can be some movement and that John Major hasn't bowed to pressure from David Trimble and the Ulster Unionists.
The High Court has been told that Geraldine Gilligan is a full partner with her husband John in the conduct of criminal enterprises. The claim was made in an affidavit by the Chief Legal Officer of the Criminal Assets Bureau, Barry Galvin.
Mr. Galvin was giving evidence in an injunction application by Mrs. Gilligan to prevent the Criminal Assets Bureau from disposing of property which was seized last week. She's also seeking the return of the property, which was removed by the Revenue Sheriff from Jessbrook, Enfield, for non-payment of tax. Mrs. Gilligan, who wasn't in court today, denies she was a partner with her husband or any other person in the conduct of any criminal enterprise, and she says she's not aware of her husband's financial affairs. In his affidavit, Mr. Galvin said Mr. Gilligan had been involved in criminal activity for many years. He said that after he was appointed as an Inspector of Taxes, he assessed the liabilities of Mr. and Mrs. Gilligan. He had access to confidential Garda files during his investigation. He concluded that the £1.7 million spent on the development of an equestrian centre at Jessbrook near Enfield were the proceeds of criminal activity. In his affidavit, Mr. Galvin said he was satisfied that Mrs. Gilligan is, and has been for a number of years, a full partner with her husband in what he called his criminal enterprises. He didn't accept Mrs. Gilligan's statement that her only income was from the operation of the equestrian centre at Jessbrook. Mrs. Gilligan, he said, operated a number of bank accounts under both her married and maiden names. According to the affidavit, £893,000 went through one bank account in Lucan over a 2-year period. Counsel for Mrs. Gilligan, Adrian Hardiman, said an enormous amount of property, from horses down to yard brushes and toys, had been seized. Mr. Galvin, he said, had raised the tax assessment for more than £1 million on the very day he was appointed. This, he said, was a gung-ho approach by someone determined to make an impression. Mrs. Gilligan, he said, was not in a position to appeal the tax assessment because her account books had been seized in a previous Garda operation. Mrs. Gilligan is challenging her liability to make tax returns on the grounds that she and her husband were living together at the time and had not elected for separate assessment. Richard Nesbitt, Senior Counsel for the Criminal Assets Bureau, said that Mrs. Gilligan was in receipt of gains and profits and had an obligation under self-assessment to make a tax return. The hearing continues tomorrow.
The 25-year-old daughter of the former Nationalist MP Bernadette McCalliskey has been remanded in custody for a week by Bow Street Magistrates Court in London. Roisin McCalliskey is wanted for questioning by the authorities in Germany in connection with the IRA mortar bomb attack on the British Army barracks at Osnabrück in June.
Roisin McCalliskey was brought to Bow Street Magistrates Court in central London from the nearby Charing Cross police station, where she'd been held overnight following her arrival from Northern Ireland. She had already spent nearly a week in custody at Castlereagh Detention Centre. Roisin McCalliskey smiled briefly at relatives and friends in the public gallery as she stepped into the dock. She was wearing a cream cardigan and a blue denim shift dress. She spoke only to answer yes to the court clerk, who read out her name, date of birth and the charges against her. Detective Constable Jean-Pierre Letizier from Scotland Yard told the court that Miss McCalliskey had been formally arrested by British police yesterday at Castlereagh Detention Centre on behalf of the German authorities, who want to question her on charges of attempted murder and possession of explosives. The German federal prosecutor alleges that she was a member of an IRA unit which carried out the mortar attack on Osnabrück British Army base last June. Several mortars were fired into the base, but no one was injured. If extradited, Roisin McCalliskey will be the first person to face charges for the attack. In court today, her solicitor Gareth Pearce told the magistrate that she would be making a bail application next week. She said Miss McCalliskey was 4.5 months pregnant with serious medical complications. She'd been seen by a doctor last night and would need to see an obstetrician this week.
She's in frail health, and she certainly ought not to be going into the conditions that are provided by the prison service for women prisoners. They are unspeakable, and she will be at physical risk, and I hope that we can get her bail as soon as possible.
Roisin McCalliskey's younger sister Deirdre was in court for the short hearing along with Sinn Féin councillor Francie Malloy. Her mother Bernadette McCalliskey did not appear. Roisin McCalliskey has been remanded in custody and will be in court again next week.
The 28-year-old Belfast man, James Anthony Corrie, was arrested in the centre of Dublin this afternoon on foot of a provisional extradition warrant from Germany. It's understood the German authorities want to question him about the Osnabrück attack. 4 more cases of BSE or mad cow disease have been confirmed here. 2 were in Cavan, the others in Cork and Tipperary. They bring the total so far this year to 58. The Family Law Act, which allows for divorce here, was signed by the President this afternoon. The Act will come into operation in February, when the first divorce applications can be made to the Circuit or High Courts. The Fine Gael Senator Liam Cosgrave has been elected Cathaoirleach of the Seanad. He succeeds the late Senator Liam Naughton, who was killed in a car crash just over a week ago. Senator Cosgrave is a son of the former Taoiseach Liam Cosgrave. Now, still to come in tonight's 9 o'clock news, the blockade that's strangling Europe's trade. We hear how it's hitting Irish business. And murdered reporter Veronica Guerin is honoured in New York by leading American journalists. Hello again. Tonight's main news: there are fears that the talks on a new national pay agreement could be close to breakdown. The country goes to the polls tomorrow in the referendum to change the bail laws. More than 2.5 million people are entitled to vote. They are being asked to decide whether judges should be given the discretion to refuse bail if they believe an accused person is likely to commit a serious offence.
With all the main political parties backing the proposed bail changes, it's been a lacklustre campaign. But over the past week or so, a spirited burst by the various groups opposed to the change has put the matter under serious examination. At issue is whether the Constitution should be amended for the 16th time by the inclusion of a new section to Article 40, which guarantees the rights of citizens. Those supporting the change say it's needed in the drive against crime and because of the number of offences committed by people out on bail. And they say it simply gives judges some further discretion in relation to the granting of bail to people charged with serious offences. Those opposed argue the amendment would lead to an erosion of civil liberties, would undermine the presumption of innocence and would lead to wrongful imprisonment. The section to be added to Article 40 of the Constitution says that provision may be made by law for the refusal of bail by a court to a person charged with a serious offence, where it is reasonably considered necessary to prevent the commission of a serious offence by that person. Posters detailing the terms of the amendment will be displayed at polling stations and on individual polling cards. Voters who approve should mark an X in the square for thaw or yes. Those who disapprove should put the X beside nil or no. Finally, there will be a second day of voting on the Aran Islands following a mix-up over polling day there. The polling stations opened on Monday, but voting cards received by the islanders told them they were to vote with the rest of the nation tomorrow. As a result, there was a low turnout and complaints about the confusion. When the matter was raised in the Dáil today by Fianna Fáil's Éamon Ó Cuív, Gaeltacht Minister Michael D. Higgins announced that because of what he termed a misunderstanding, islanders who hadn't voted on Monday could do so tomorrow.
French truck drivers and their employers have resumed talks this evening aimed at resolving the 10-day-old strike that's paralysed the country. After a 20-hour negotiating session ended this morning, the government mediator said substantial progress had been made on two of the truckers' key demands: an earlier retirement age and shorter working hours. The drivers are also demanding a 10% pay rise.
PJ Sharkey is a driver with Burtonport Fishermen's Cooperative. Like most hauliers, he only gets paid when he's driving. He's been laid off since his return from France, but has a lot of sympathy with the French hauliers.
Well, we were in France last week at the start of the strike, and we got caught in the blockade. Lost about 3 hours, but there was no hassle that let us through. In fact, it stood back out of our way. Well, I would have sympathy with the French drivers as well, because especially where we go around Brittany, being Irish, the French treat us very well.
Burtonport Fishermen's Cooperative is one of many which has lodged claims against the French government for loss of earnings. Eugene Hannigan says fishermen stand to lose £70,000 a week if the dispute continues.
The French government are totally negligent in regard to facing up to their own responsibilities, and there's absolutely no question of getting compensation from them. And we want our government to push that our fishermen here get duly compensated for the loss of income.
With trucks such as this out of action until the strike is settled, many drivers hope their French counterparts win their demands in quickly, so they can get back on the road and start earning again.
The leader of the country's Catholic primary school managers has warned that the future of denominational schools cannot be guaranteed if the government alters its new equality bill. Sister Eileen Randall has issued a strong warning against the government giving in to pressure from the Democratic left backbencher Kathleen Lynch.
The Equality Employment Bill was agreed by the Cabinet almost 5 months ago. It outlaws discrimination in the workplace, but allows discrimination where it's essential for the maintenance of the religious ethos of an institution, or where it's reasonable to avoid offending the religious sensitivities of the schools or the hospital's members or clients. Last week, Democratic left TD Kathleen Lynch broke ranks with her government colleagues threatening to amend the clause allowing religious discrimination if Mervyn Taylor failed to do so himself. But tomorrow's Irish Catholic newspaper publishes a letter from the leader of the country's Catholic primary school managers warning Mr Taylor not to give in to pressure in Leinster House.
There is pressure for an amendment to be introduced to that bill, and the amendment that is being mentioned would appear to make it virtually impossible for schools to protect their ethos, and obviously that's quite illogical.
The General Secretary of the INTO, Senator Joe O'Toole, has said the new law as drafted would probably allow school managers to fire a teacher living with a partner outside wedlock.
Could anybody seriously suggest that no matter how hostile or destructive or dangerous or damaging a person's activities might be, that they could never, ever be taken into account simply on the basis that they happen after 3:30 in the afternoon, in other words, in the teacher's private life? Of course, teachers, like all employees, are perfectly entitled to their private life, but if their private life impacts on the nature of their work, then there may be questions to be answered.
Tonight, a source in Mervyn Taylor's department said the minister is trying to find a compromise proposal that would satisfy churches and parents on the one hand and teachers on the other.
The funeral of the broadcaster and sports commentator Michael O'Hare took place this morning in Dublin. Hundreds of mourners attended, including the President, Mary Robinson, and leading figures from the worlds of politics and sports.
Not far from GAA headquarters in Croke Park, in the very church where he married Molly, Corpus Christi on Home Farm Road, Michael O'Hare's funeral mass was celebrated today by Archbishop Dermot Clifford, the patron of the GAA. The President, Mrs Robinson, led the mourners, among them Jack Boothman, Uachtarán Cumann Lút Cash Gael, Ord Stewart Liam Mulvihill, and many former presidents of the association. The chief mourners were Michael's wife Molly, his daughters Mary and Anne, sons Tony, Michael and Peter, daughters-in-law, son-in-law, and grandchildren who carried gifts for the offertory, including a hurley and slitter, a racing cap and a commentator's microphone.
I think he was an embellishment to the whole game. I think he popularised it more than any player or group of players could possibly have done. Micheál is the man that made the GAA, I think.
He was the sporting supremo in Ireland for 5 decades. Well known after that, I don't know what it would take. He's probably the best known Irish person of all time.
After a lifetime dedicated to sport and 6 decades behind the microphone, Ireland's best-loved sports commentator was finally laid to rest in Fingal Cemetery in County Dublin.
Finally tonight, America's top journalists have honoured the murdered crime reporter Veronica Guerin. The Committee to Protect Journalists paid tribute to her at its annual awards dinner in New York last night. Last year, Veronica Guerin attended the event to receive the group's International Press Freedom Award, which honours reporters persecuted in the course of their work.
In the Park Avenue splendour of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, America's leading reporters came to help the cause of press freedom across the globe at the cost of $1,000 a plate. At the annual benefit dinner for the Committee to Protect Journalists, they honoured reporters from India, Mexico and Palestine. In front of one of the most influential media gatherings in America, there was an Irish perspective of Veronica Guerin's legacy.
It is cold comfort for Veronica, from wherever she is watching now, that in the 5 months since her death, Ireland's crime syndicates, whom she, for the first time, sought to identify and expose to the public, are in retreat. Veronica achieved in death what she set out to achieve in life.
The regrettable thing is that we're all probably targets, unfortunately.
In the absolute silence of the Grand Ballroom, the audience watched a video tribute and then listened to musician Joni Madden with her rendition of Maná na hÉireann.
Veronica Guerin remembered at home and abroad. Tonight's main news again is that the talks on a new national pay agreement have run into serious difficulties this evening. It's feared they could be close to breakdown. That's all from us until tomorrow at 9. From all the team, a very good night to you.
Hello there and a very good evening to you. The rain that troubled the east coast has just shifted offshore in the last couple of hours. We can see it on our radar here, moving up along the Irish Sea. It's just drifting very, very slowly over towards Britain. But we can also see here that there's a good number of showers pushing down onto the Ulster coast, one or two of them finding their way onto the North Connacht coast. And that'll continue, I think, through the night hours. The showers turning up along the northwest and later probably in the west coast under clearing skies. In the rest of the country, though, it's a question of mist and some fog patches and probably getting quite chilly. Temperatures going to fall down to 0, maybe -1 Celsius, but that does mean a frost, and where the roads are wet, and that's many eastern counties, we could see icy roads around about the place by morning time. But they'll be swept away very quickly tomorrow, because we're going to have a big change in our weather tomorrow as another weather system comes rushing in from the Atlantic, bringing rain and bringing strong winds. It's not going to hang around for very long, moving rapidly across Ireland and Britain. That's the situation on Friday. By then we'll have a fairly strong west to northwest airflow. This weather front never too far from our south or southwest coast probably will come back to trouble parts of our country later on Friday. But tomorrow morning, mist and fog to begin with, but a lot of sunshine too, really across most of the country. Just the west is likely to be cloudy from the word go, but that cloud very quickly thickening up and moving eastwards and bringing rain with it. The rain into Munster and Connacht by noon. By afternoon, the rain everywhere, and heaviest, I think, across the south and southeast of the country. Could be some quite heavy bursts there, but not hanging around for very long. By evening time, the dry weather already into the north and the northwest. Temperatures tomorrow between 9 and 13 Celsius, and that makes it a pretty mild day, especially down here over Munster and into South Leinster, but a very windy one. The winds coming from the southwest, later from the west, 25 or 30 miles an hour, stronger offshore, where they'll touch gale force. And then moving into tomorrow night, the last of that cloud and rain pushing away, and a few more showers showing up across the north of the country, clear skies in other places. By Friday, a fair amount of sunshine to look forward to. Still those few showers in the north coast, and later on some cloud building up in the south and bringing a drop of drizzle back to the coast.